discussing a recent podcast by David Deutsch and Naval Ravikant on Naval's podcast series. I think this is probably the most important podcast that I've listened to in the last years, and that has to do with the fact that it's David Deutsch. David Deutsch is really the most important living philosopher right now, as far as I'm concerned, and I share that with Naval. That's why he had him on. He was also on the Tim Ferriss show, and also Brett Hall discussed that podcast. That's how I actually got to know, because I don't follow Naval for some reason, but doesn't matter. Shout out to Brett Hall again, shout out to Naval, shout out to Tim Ferriss. Great job bringing a guy like David Deutsch on in itself is already huge. I think most podcasts are defined by the guests they have on, and this is a good example of how good of a podcast series this must be. Let's say the Tim Ferriss show or the Naval show, that they have somebody like David Deutsch on. Now, having said that, of course, Tim Ferriss kind of the McDonald's of intellectuals. In other words, he wants to package everything in 5-minute bites and all that. That's fine, good for him, kudos. Naval is the exact opposite. I think he does one podcast every 2 months. The podcasts themselves are not very long, which is really good, because he really focuses on the essential, and I think that is a great thing. So having said that, let's get into the meat here. I want to discuss a couple of things that David Deutsch said. David Deutsch is the kind of person that no matter how much you read and how much you think you understand him, every time you read or hear him, you will learn something new. And this is exactly what happened here. So I think a couple of things that I'm going to talk about here, in particular, optimism, general artificial intelligence, wealth. Those are sort of the three, and maybe the meaning of life, multiverse and the meaning of life. And then I have criticisms. I actually have criticisms for David Deutsch. I think there's a risk of anthropomorphism, is that the word? When you're looking at things through the human perspective, and then maybe get a little bit too much bias. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go into more details about that. This is not even on podcast. It's April 1st, 2023. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is up 10.7%. The market's up 1.4%. For the year, we're up 68.7%. The market's up 7.3%. We're out from 61.4%. There was a decent PCE number, meaning basically inflation is expected to be not as high as feared, and that has driven the Nasdaq up. I think overall the situation in the market is that all the banking crises around the world are going to intensify, and that the national banks will bail them out one way or the other. So we will have a sort of a sneaking QE basically happening. This is our view. This is the reason why the market's rallying, and we believe that that is justified. The risks are, of course, that something derails, in particular politically. And before I go, actually, let me talk a little bit about my trip. I'm in Zurich right now. This is part of my leg, my Europe leg that I'm doing. I started my last series. My first leg was landing in Istanbul. On the way to Zurich, now I'm here. And I met some of my friends yesterday, and one of them was pretty aggressively, I would say, attacking me, for lack of a better word, and it was kind of revealing. I mean, he's one of my best friends, so this is not some random person yelling and screaming. This is a really good friend. But what he basically said is, you live in Palo Alto, you guys think you run the world. Well, you don't, and we have something to say, and it's really bad what's going on with all the monopolization of businesses and platforms and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into details here, but he kind of said a few things that are right. I mean, the platform technologies that have evolved through the internet and centralized around Silicon Valley, they're very powerful. They generate a lot of wealth, and they leave some people stranded. Now, I've tried to make the point that they're still better than not having them. We are still better off having them than not having them. And that the so-called lack of competition that he was referring to. In other words, he was telling me things about the movie industry and such things. It doesn't matter. The details, again, don't matter. What I want to bring home here is the criticism and the frustration. This is a person that is actually in the music and movie business, so he's in the entertainment business. And his claim is that companies like Facebook and Google and so on and so forth have really almost monopolized all these businesses, and that is very bad. And I agree with that. And the conversation was really about, look, the neoclassical model of economics and what we call capitalism today has probably lived itself out. That's not the point. The point is that we need better solutions for current models of how we organize ourselves. And I am absolutely on board with that. I think I am on board with Peter Thiel and all these people who say, look, to say that neoclassical economics or this sort of capitalism that got popular with Thatcher and Reagan, to say that this could have worked if we had done it right and all that, this sounds like communism. Oh, it could have worked if we had done it right. Well, we didn't do it right. And people don't want it. People feel unfairly treated. People feel they didn't get enough of the pie. The pie is growing and people have it better. But the inequalities are too high and therefore it doesn't work. So we have to find a better way. Now, my friend is suggesting there's this London School of Economics lady that writes about how the government should take bigger, bolder actions. So he's on that board, and I am vehemently against that for the simple reason that I think we have to start with the government if we want to reorganize ourselves. So it's not about the private enterprise. The private enterprise is doing a good enough job. They can do better, but what's not good enough is the way government is organized. So we have to start with the government. And instead of giving them more power, and more importantly, instead of giving them more abilities to vaguely define what is and what isn't, and then sort of mission creep themselves into that. A perfect example is climate change. It's very convenient for government officials to be worried about the climate when they don't know exactly what it is, when they don't make an effort to define what climate change actually means, and most importantly, don't have solutions because they don't even know what the problem is. So, having said that, the way we see this evolution going forward is through actually narrowing the scope of government. And I use the analogy of your dishwasher, for example. If your dishwasher washes your dishes and does a good job in washing your dishes, then your dishwasher has a lot of purpose, and it is a great thing to have. If your dishwasher all of a sudden starts deciding that he's only going to wash, or it will only wash, if you eat vegan food, and it will refuse to clean meat, or it will only do something if you first did a prayer, or you know where I'm going here. So, in other words, you don't want mission creep in pretty much anything that has a job to do. And the government has a job to do. There's no question about it. The problem is, what is the job? And I think that's where we need to start, when we start to reorganizing ourselves, so when we start rethinking the concept of how we want to live in terms of, let's say, economics and so on and so forth. So that was sort of my conversation in a nutshell. I think we were able to come to a good point, but that's, I think, just because, well, he's my friend and he tried to make an effort not to have a sort of a violent conversation and all that stuff. I don't know how this would have gone if we hadn't been, knowing each other for 30 years. So that's just, I wanted to say that because it's part of my trip, and sometimes I talk about nature, sometimes I talk about the way people live and work and so on and so forth. And this is now a conversation I had with friends here in Zurich. So let's go now to the point. to this podcast series that I'm talking about, in particular, the interview with David Deutsch. So a couple of things I want to mention. First, David Deutsch talks about optimism. And the way he defines optimism is it is the notion or the thought that humans are good at creating knowledge and solving problems, and that the ability to do that is sort of infinite, and that's why his book is called The Beginning of Infinity, and that therefore we can define almost anything that we need to solve. And he's also saying good problems are solvable, bad problems are not solvable. So that's a good start. So a bad problem is not solvable. Can we solve climate change? We can't, because we don't know what the problem is. Can we solve the problem of inefficient energy production and consumption? Like Tesla, for example, stated in their mission Part 3 or whatever they call it. Why is there a French word in there? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, they just want to use more electricity and less fossil fuels. That's the goal of Tesla. A problem that can be solved, a problem that can be tackled, solved, all that stuff. So again, a good problem is solvable. And optimism just means that we can attack pretty much any problem. With enough knowledge, we can solve those problems that we have. And it is part of our job to define the right problems, to ask the right questions, and then find those solutions. This is a very important job. Wealth is a set of optional transformations, or a set of transformation, a set of possibilities to do transformations. That is the definition of wealth, according to David Deutsch, a very, very powerful definition. The transformations themselves are a function of knowledge. Actually, he's not going as far as I am, which is he's actually equating wealth with knowledge. I think Naval says in the interview, at some point he says, wealth is a corollary of knowledge, or it follows from knowledge. I would equate it, and this is something I would like to ask David Deutsch, what he thinks about. Knowledge and wealth are the same thing. The more knowledge you have, the more wealth you have. Actually, he's saying that because he's talking about this example that, let's say he's saying gold is not really wealth, because eventually gold will be replaced by something eventually. In the long run, people will find ways to replace gold. It could take a long time, but it's not the only thing that will keep you wealthy in the long run is knowledge, which is very powerful. And that is the set of possible transformations. So the more knowledge you have, I'm just walking around now in the Polytech in Zurich, a place where a lot of knowledge has been created. Wolfgang Pauli was teaching here, for example. So a very powerful place to talk about knowledge, and a very intriguing place to talk about knowledge. So again, I want to just bring this point home that knowledge creation is the first and most important step towards wealth creation. There is no other. I mean, there is no other, at least not as we know it. We might be able to redefine things, and maybe in the future we create new knowledge about knowledge itself, and maybe we can have derivatives of knowledge creation, and who knows. But right now, where we stand, the way it looks, the lay of the land is that knowledge creation is wealth, because wealth is a set of transformations, and transformations depend on knowledge. Knowledge is a solution to a problem. It's defined by something that is hard to come by and hard to vary, which is maybe for some people a little vague, but I think it's a good start. We can create more knowledge here too. Knowledge about what knowledge is. Again, the epistemology is a very underrated study, because if wealth is knowledge, we should be thinking about what knowledge is a lot harder. And I don't think we are thinking hard enough. So for us in the investment business, in the wealth creation business, understanding what This is really, this is a big deal, and this gets me to a point that Naval said, which is a very interesting thing. And here's the thing. So Naval said that according to Deutsch, the best way to do things is in such a way that if you could see the whole multiverse, you would see those things copied in many multiverses. So it's kind of like a guidance towards life, right? Let me do X because I think X is the right thing to do, because I think this is something that probably is going to be copied in many multiverses. It's a good thing. Now, I find that an interesting thought, and let's leave it at that, because there's a lot of criticisms here. This is where my anthropomorphism criticism comes in, because who says that? Aren't you biased by your ethical and moral knowledge that you have today? Probably somebody 200 years ago would have said the same thing and thought, well, if I do X, let's say, if I proliferate the Christian church in South America and enslave people there or stuff like that, that would have been something that gets multiplied in the multiverse and so on and so forth. And today we would say certain other things, and then in 100 years we will say other things again. So it's not so clear what that is. So in other words, this could be a little bit of a tautology where you say, oh, I found a new avenue of sort of defining what the meaning of life is. It's this thing that gets copied in the multiverses. But what does that really mean? And I can't test it, and I can't look into the multiverse. In other words, if I do action X, I can't go and see if that's something that's being copied. So it's a little bit tough. So, but Deutsch is a lot more precise here. Okay, he thinks that knowledge is something that's hard to vary, solves problems, and most likely is going to be copied in other multiverses, because that's what knowledge does. It proliferates itself. It's like a meme. It's like a gene. I mean, no, it's like evolution. Evolution and human knowledge creation are the same thing. Knowledge creation is the same thing. However, what humans have done is found a better way to create knowledge, according to David Deutsch, which is they can foresee things. We can plan. And this here is my biggest criticism now to the Deutschian worldview, because I think he is caught in an oxymoron. On the one hand, he's saying that the biggest power of humans is the ability to plan, to foresee, to work towards solving problems. And that's true. We do that. We have things like purpose and so on and so forth. We believe that evolution doesn't have that. We believe so. We believe evolution works more the other way around. It just does things, and then somehow it gets validated by nature or not. Now, he's also saying that the advantage of humans relative to nature is, or excuse me, evolution, is that we have creativity. We can do things just like that, or we can come up with things. He talks about disobedience. And I think there Naval took him off track a little bit, because Naval spoke about disobedience. He said we should raise our kids to be disobedient because that's a good thing. And here's the oxymoron here. Well, look, if you foresee, if you are good at foreseeing stuff, and if knowledge is relevant, then how can you be disobedient? Shouldn't you use that knowledge that has been created, all the moral, ethical, the norms, all of that stuff? So why should you be disobedient? But then he's saying, well, that's exactly our power, to be disobedient, relative to, let's say, a robot, a self-driving car. That thing cannot be disobedient, because that thing has to do always the same thing. Now, he's then also saying, by the way, that general artificial intelligence, in his point of view, we're very far away from that, because general artificial intelligence is something that has this ability, like humans, to just come up with ideas, to be creative. Now, we don't know exactly what creativity is. And because we don't know what creativity is, we can't program it, and therefore we don't have any kind of clue right now how to actually create general artificial intelligence. What we're creating the AI that we're creating is narrow AI, and that is very useful. That's what we call robots, and that's fine, but that's not AGI. AGI, according to Deutsch, requires creativity, and we don't know how to do this. So to summarize, the three big points that I got from this interview with Deutsch is: number one, wealth equals knowledge. Knowledge is not just necessary for things like human progress and such and so on and so forth. It is absolutely omnipotent in the worldview of optimism, which is a view that we can keep engineering ourselves into a future that is better than the past with knowledge. And we define that. That's optimism. Wealth equals knowledge, and wealth is a set of transformations which depend on knowledge. And the third point is that artificial general intelligence requires creativity, and creativity is something we don't know right now, so therefore we can't really create any artificial general intelligence so far. A nice takeaway also is this idea of the meaning of life, which is something that copies itself throughout the multiverse. I think it's just a nice idea. It needs a lot more discussion. It's kind of a new thing, but just a nice sort of another door to open, another avenue to think. And then I have one big criticism, and the criticism is I feel like kind of an oxymoron, which is that on the one hand, creativity, human knowledge creation is different from evolution because we have foresight, but then we're also disobedient. Well, if we have foresight, then how can we be disobedient? Aren't we as random as evolution, or what's the difference? Is it maybe just a time scale? Those are the kinds of questions I would have for David Deutsch. Thank you.